Hello YouTube, Sandre here. This is going to be a response to David Pakman and his video that he made, I think it's about a week ago now, about gun control, where he makes the argument that there's ample evidence that gun laws do reduce gun crime and specifically homicides with guns or rifles. And the purpose of this video is to basically show light on the actual stats and why David Pakman is erroneous in his in many of his claims that he makes throughout this video. But before I start this, let me just make one thing clear, because I know that I will get some new viewers to this video. I know that some people are going to watch this video who have never watched my content before, and just because I'm responding to David Pakman, they may make all kinds of, assumptions about me. Let me just make this clear to you from the get-go. I am not some kind of lunatic right-wing gun nut. Okay, I'm definitely not. Now, the thing is though, since I am in the scientific arena, I work as a chemistry teacher. I work as a substitute chemistry teacher. Chemistry is a natural science, and one thing you learn in a natural science, in fact, this is what science is built upon. You're supposed to make your observations, collect your data, and if possible, do experiments to either disprove or verify. And from that, you gather a deeper understanding as to the true nature of our reality. That is the point of science. And as such, I have learned to keep my own opinions to the best degree possible out of, what is actually true and whatnot. If there is evidence for something, I am forced to accept that, regardless of what I think about that truth. And when it comes to gun control laws, I wouldn't say that they necessarily don't have any effect whatsoever, but if you believe that they have, this amazing, huge effect, and that they would essentially, drastically decrease homicides by guns or rifles in the United States, I'm going to have to tell you, you are deluded or ignorant of the facts. Again, I'm not saying that they can't have an effect at all. I'm just saying that if they do have an effect, it's not nearly to the degree that David Pakman makes it out to be. But anyway, let's start. And I decided to make this video an analysis video rather than a straight up debunk video, because I'm gonna give David, the benefit of the doubt. I'm gonna give him, all the goodwill I can. Okay, I'm gonna give him the best circumstance for this analysis, to assume that he's not being dishonest in any way, that he simply is ignorant of the facts. Okay? And I wouldn't even say that he's wrong on some things in his video. However, even when it comes to those parts, there are certain facts that you should be aware of, alongside what he has to say, to get a clearer image. And all of this will be, of course, apparent to you as you're watching my analysis here. But let's begin.
I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the reality of whether gun safety regulations work to reduce not just gun violence, but violence more generally. Because the right has a lot of really concise and neat sounding talking points. I've said before, the right has the advantage on framing. George Lakoff has written about this. Abortion is murder, so it should be illegal. That is a really simple talking point. And the left position on abortion is not the opposite of that. It is nuanced, it is complex. And on guns, the right has guns don't kill people, people kill people.
All right, see, the problem I have with the beginning here is that David is sort of phrasing things here in a way that I'm not saying it's dishonest, but it is very simplified. I think when it comes to the topic of abortion, actually what you will find is that regardless of what people identify as, whether they identify as right wing or left wing or in the center, people have a very nuanced opinion on abortion across the board. This is what you find in polls and whatever. In fact, the majority of Americans agree, and this includes both, left and right-wing people as well as people in the center. They agree that abortion should be legal up to a certain point, up to about the second trimester. After that point, almost no one thinks it should still be legal. And yeah, abortion is a very complicated issue. It's not a straightforward issue at all, and I think it's a little bit misleading and simplified to say that the left necessarily has the nuance on this and the right doesn't. I wouldn't say that at all. You will find plenty of people on the right who are, in favor of abortion being legal up to a certain point, just like most people on the left. The right doesn't just consist of the religious right, But anyway, let's continue.
More guns would make us safer. Gun-free zones are the problem because only good guys follow the rules and the bad guys will bring guns into gun-free zones. More guns, less crime. People will find a way to do the killing even without a gun, so banning guns or making them harder to access doesn't do anything. Now, there are actually a whole host of ways to think about this, and all of them point in one direction, which is actually gun safety rules and restrictions do work. There was a really good post on our subreddit by a user named Nostalgic Sayan, and some of their ideas are in this segment. Now, one argument that's common is, it doesn't matter what you make illegal, people will get it if it's a good way to kill people. Has anybody heard of a mass killing via grenade?
Right, and as you can tell, if you are in any way educated on this subject, you can already tell that pretty quickly in this video, it goes downhill. And David commits a huge blunder here, because David, if you simply checked on this, if you simply did research before you made this video, you would find that actually, even though grenades are illegal in pretty much any nation on earth to the civilian population, including the US, grenades are actually very common. Grenade attacks are very common. It does indeed seem like, even though grenades are strictly regulated, in fact illegal for the average civilian to have, criminals don't care. Take Sweden, which is another nation that is usually brought up by people like David Pakman for, having strict gun laws, but, also having, proportionally speaking, of course, compared to the US, much lower levels of gun violence. However, we have seen a very huge increase in grenade attacks in Sweden, even though these are not allowed at all to the civilian population whatsoever. So it's very apparent that when it comes to grenades, yes, not only have we heard of these attacks, David, they are actually far more common than you let on here. So either, you are simply unaware of this, and you would have simply been aware if you simply did, research before this video, or yeah, you are deliberately dishonest on this. But again, I'm not going to assume the latter. I'm going to assume that you're simply ignorant, because I'm going to argue in good faith. But let's continue.
Grenades are easy to detonate. They have a big blast radius. You don't have to be nearly as accurate as you do with a firearm. Yet there are no mass killing incidents involving grenades. Well, why?
No, David. No killings whatsoever, huh? Again, just take a look at this list. It's quite common, actually.
Not. Turns out there's really strict regulation of grenades.
Yes, and despite these strict regulations, in fact, it's not only regulated, it's illegal for the average civilian to have grenades of any kind, even in the US, but still these attacks happen, and they're more frequent than you would guess.
Really difficult to get. Another example, M4 and AR-15 rifles are very similar. Different barrel sizes. The M4 has some firing modes, 3-round burst, and fully auto firing options. But all else being equal, M4s are harder to get, they're more expensive. The mass shootings are overwhelmingly AR-15s and never M4s. Wow, what a shocker. What about just in general, fully automatic weapons?
See, the problem here, David, is that you assume that just because we go for the AR-15, which is easier to get than the, I can't remember if you said M14 or M16, but the other rifle, regardless, you assume that the problem is that one gun is easier to get than the other, and it's somehow proven by them getting the gun that is easier to get. Well, my question to you would simply be, if you're a criminal, which gun would you go for? The one that's easy to get or the one that's harder to get, but you could still get if you wanted to? Well, the answer is pretty simple. You're going to go for the gun regardless, which is easier to get. Even if you could get the other one, it's just a little bit harder. But let me ask you another thing then, David. If both were equally hard to get, if you really wanted to kill people, would you still try and get one of them? The answer is, of course, still yes. This doesn't mean anything, David. You could take any example of this and argue that that thing in particular is too easy to get. For instance, you have a problem with knife attacks in certain areas of Britain. And actually, most of these knife attacks are not committed with, big knives such as machetes. They're usually committed with kitchen knives. Now, by your reasoning, the problem is obviously that the kitchen knives are simply too easy to get. You should regulate kitchen knives just like machetes. Well, again, if you make both equally hard to get, if you want to have a knife to, kill some other gang member or whatever, you are still going to get that knife. You just go for the one that's easier to get because, well, of course you do. Human beings are lazy by design. It's the path of least resistance. I mean, this doesn't mean anything.
Fully automatic weapons would do a ton of killing in a mass shooting, but they aren't used because you need to jump through all sorts of legal hoops to get them. They're really expensive, so the laws do work.
Actually, David, the reason that you don't see the other types of rifles that you talk about is, well, actually the main reason is they're much bigger and bulkier and heavier. There's physical constraints we're talking about here. You see that minigun, for instance. Now, Columbine was deadly as it was. For what Columbine was, it was deadly enough. But can you imagine just how deadly it would have been if they actually had a minigun instead of just regular machine guns? Well, yeah, it would be far deadlier, but there's a reason why you're probably never going to see too many of these mass shootings with an actual minigun, as you see here in this clip that he's showing, because they're really, really, really heavy and bulky and big. You see, these mass shooters tend to go for the smaller types of machine guns that are just small enough to be, not too heavy as well as not too bulky, and so they can still be concealed. That is most likely the reason you don't see these bigger guns that would, you're right, these bigger guns would probably be even deadlier because they have more firepower, and they can even shoot further and whatever, and some of them have better accuracy as well, but there's a natural constraint here, there's a physical constraint, and that is the weight and the bulkiness and the size. These mass shooters, they want to be concealed up until the point they commit the deed. This is, logically speaking, the most likely answer as to why you don't see the other types of machine guns that you were talking about, the other types of rifles. So, yeah, no, this doesn't mean anything either.
The guns that are more difficult to get and more expensive aren't used in mass shootings.
They also happen to be far heavier, far bigger and bulkier.
So then some people will bring up, well, the real problem is handguns and individual homicides, not mass shootings and the types of firearms used within them. It's really a distraction.
No, David, it's not a distraction at all. It's true. What you will find is, if you really cared about the type of weaponry that is most used to kill people in the United States, you would go for handguns. This is undeniable. I would argue that what's the real distraction is to go after AR-15s and these other rifles because, yes, they're mostly used for these mass shooting events, but when it comes to average homicides by, any kind of firearm, it's almost always guns. Yes, guns are the firearms that kill the most people in the United States, overwhelmingly so. It's not even close. So no, David, when people bring that up to you, and people who argue like you, that is not a distraction, that is just a statistical fact.
You can kill one person in many, many different ways, and it is difficult to stop a determined person from killing one other person. But the success of mass shootings or mass killing events is much more dictated by the firepower and the destructive nature of that firepower that's available. And if you zoom out and you look at studies across many countries, the theme, the arc is homicide rate goes down when gun restrictions are made law. But it's got to be taken seriously. It can't be just one law. There's a study published by Oxford University Press. What do we know about the association between firearm legislation and firearm-related injuries? What we learn is that...
And see, this is where we get into territory where, you've heard of the saying, there's three kinds of lies in this world. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. And this is one of those situations where the statistics aren't what they seem. Notice how he says fire-related injuries. Now, when you bring in injuries or, suicides by guns or rifles or any other kind of firearm, you're going to have a very big skewing of the statistics regarding deaths by, firearms. And it's actually dishonest to include that into that statistic because when you ask people about gun deaths, well, the main thing they think about is actual homicides. People have actually killed someone else with a firearm. They don't primarily think of people who off themselves with a gun or accidentally kill themselves with a gun, and to include that in any kind of statistic is deeply dishonest. There needs to be a distinction between the two. Because, yes, of course, if you have more guns in circulation, yeah, people are more likely to kill themselves with guns. People are more likely to accidentally kill themselves with guns. That is just a fact. That is a natural consequence of having, availability of guns. But the question isn't, David, if people accidentally kill themselves or if they willingly kill themselves, but whether they willingly kill other people. That is what we talk about in gun deaths. And you referring to statistics regarding other matters that don't have to do with actual homicides is an actual distraction, ironically. Hello, I just want to add this into the video quickly because I actually found out that the study that you just saw on screen and that David, referenced by the Oxford Union, there's actually a follow-up to that paper. It's a correction to that paper by the authors of that paper called What Do We Know About the Association Between Firearm Legislation and Firearm-Related Injuries? Because apparently in the previous study, the original one, there was a shitload of inaccuracies and flaws. And so they had to make a correction. And, but before I show you how many inaccuracies they had, in the original paper, I want you to internally guess. What do you think? 3, 4, maybe 7 errors in total? Actually, no. There's there was a shitload of errors. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, blah 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 blah. Yeah, that's wow. Wow, that's pathetic. That, I mean, that is like around 30 or so. Now, what I'm wondering is, how do you possibly fuck up this badly? How? And this is another reason why the first study shouldn't be taken seriously, to be honest, because if you make this many inaccuracies um, regarding your research, I'm not going to take you seriously. No one should. This is unforgivable. Having this many errors in what's supposed to be, a very prestigious publication, that's an embarrassment. So yeah, fuck this paper. David, this is shit. This is absolute garbage. Do you check into this stuff? I'm serious. Like this is embarrassing, David.
It usually takes a pretty major legislative overhaul. It's not just background checks alone to see significant changes. Restricting access to guns and their purchase is associated with a reduction in firearm deaths.
And here we get into the biggest problems of David Pakman's arguments here, as well as what other people argue when it comes to gun control laws. Remember, like I said before, that I'm not saying that gun control laws don't, necessarily have any kind of impact on the general homicide rate whatsoever. I do think that under certain circumstances, the evidence actually points that they can. However, they don't have the effect. If they do have the effect, it's not to the degree that David makes it out to be, by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the effect, if it is there, seems to be negligible. Let's take an example here. Let's take Australia, because Australia is usually painted up by people like David Pakman and Kyle Kalinske. I know that Kyle Kalinske in a debate with Razorfist actually brought up Australia specifically and talked about how the ban in 1996 supposedly showed a major decrease in homicides. The problem is, that's not at all what you see. What you see is that, yeah, there's a little bit of a negative trend around that period, and it continues a little bit, and then it halts, and it increases, and then it halts, and then it decreases quite significantly, but that decrease happens about 15 years after the ban, and there's really no way to tell that that's because of the ban. But then all of a sudden it increases again very drastically. And looking at these stats, you see a negative trend, yes, but this negative trend actually starts before the ban in 1996 in Australia. Let's take a look at other nations on this graph. You see that the gun violence, and most specifically homicides by firearms, fluctuate. They go up and down and up and down and up and down. And during this period, you have different gun control laws being implemented in different states in the US, and we don't see any real impact by them, though, in the general statistics. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail later on as well when it comes to comparing, different states to other states in the US, because it's not the same story across the board. But yeah, let's continue.
This tells us that just passing background checks is likely to have only a very small effect. What we need is a combination of 100% universal background checks, yes, restrictions on the most deadly weapons, requiring permitting and licensing for guns. I'd like to see mandatory insurance policies for gun owners as well. And Elizabeth Warren is proposing a lot of this stuff, and I'll get to that a little bit later. When you look at countries like South Africa and Australia, even when you look within states in the United States that have made changes, the results are very clear. But in the end, none of this matters.
And actually, no, David, that's not true. Let's take an example in particular here. As we all know, the United States has a firearm homicide rate that is higher than Canada on average. Problem is, though, Canada has almost as much of a gun culture as the US. Yes, gun ownership in Canada per capita is very much comparable to the gun ownership per capita in the US. And yet they don't have nearly the same rate of homicides, especially not by firearms. How is this? That's very odd, isn't it? Now let's take this deeper. Let's take a look at states in the US. Let's take a look at New Hampshire. New Hampshire has fairly lax gun laws. It's a pretty lax state when it comes to that. And it actually has a homicide rate by firearms that is lower per capita, noticeably lower than at least most provinces of Canada. That's odd. In fact, there's other states you can look to as well within the United States of America where they have lax gun laws and they actually have fewer homicide rates by firearms specifically than certain provinces of Canada. And so what this tells us, David, is that guns are not the only factor in this equation. Obviously, there's other things going on. Now, let's go back to the mass shootings in particular. Why is it that mass shootings by these lone gunmen have increased so exponentially the last few decades? Well, it can't be the accessibility of these heavier firearms because, David, these guns were just as accessible in the beginning of the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 50s, yada, yada, yada. And yet it wasn't until the later half of the 90s, such as with the Columbine event, that you started to see these mass shootings increase. And now we have a lot of them. Another thing as well that David doesn't mention is that many of these mass shootings as of late aren't just by these lone gunmen, but they're also committed by Islamic terrorists. However, the statistics doesn't make any differentiation between these terrorist events and these lone maniacs gunning people down. So it's not just an increase in these lone gunmen, doing these violent acts. It's also an increase, generally speaking, in terrorism in the U.S. that we're talking about. And yet David doesn't mention this. And again, I'm going to argue in good faith, and I'm going to assume that it's because of his ignorance and not because he's being dishonest. But nonetheless, my point still stands. Why is it that you've always had access to these heavier types of firearms, generally speaking, in the US, but it wasn't until the late 1990s that you started to see an increase in mass shootings? What this means is undeniably that the guns don't seem to be the problem. They are just not the problem. This is observable. It's an observable fact. So what has changed? Well, unlike people like David, I'm not going to argue to be some kind of authority on the subject. I'm not going to argue that I know all the answers. I'm not going to speak in definitives and in absolutes. What I am going to say, though, is that you have a problem with mental health in the US. In fact, you and people like Cal Kalinske and Sam Cedar and whatnot talk about this in other videos. And yet, David, you don't mention this in this video, which I find very odd. You talk about how you have basically no existing security net for people with mental health issues. Now, you have so many of these horror stories where these kids go to school, and even though other students find that their behavior is antisocial, nothing happens. And the vast majority of these cases, such as the Columbine event, could have been, prevented if someone had, detected these kids and put in, efforts to get them help. But like I said, when you look at the stats, it's pretty obvious. The accessibility of these firearms is simply not the problem.
Because on this issue, the facts don't matter. They are well funded on the pro-gun side. They are well equipped to dismiss any study and to tell you that you're a bad person for wanting this stuff and you're against freedom.
David, don't you find this language to be fairly disingenuous? Because this is what you accuse the right wing of doing when you talk about abortion and how it should be legal. And by the way, let me just make this clear. Yeah, I am one of those people who think that abortion should be legal up to the second trimester. And you argue that the right makes all of these sweeping accusations against the left and calls them baby killers and whatever because they won't think that abortion should be legal. Well, this is what you're doing. You're doing the exact same thing now. Something to think about.
And in the end, in addition to these changes legislatively, there has to be a cultural change. I've been talking about this for years at this point.
And now we get to another point that I want to make. And again, like I've said before a few times in this video so far, I do think that under the right circumstances, gun control laws may actually have an impact, although not nearly to the same degree as David makes it out to be. But I do think that, yes, under some circumstances, gun control laws may actually work to some degree. However, in these nations such as, Sweden, Norway, and Australia, and whatever, not only did you already have incredibly low homicide rates compared to the US to begin with, but you never really had that much of a gun culture to begin with. And yeah, I do think that if you have a nation where the overwhelming part of the population already is unarmed, I don't think that it's controversial to argue that maybe gun control laws have an effect in those nations. The thing is, though, David, in the U.S. you have a huge gun culture. It's massive. The gun ownership per capita in the U.S. is massive. And as such, to argue that gun control laws would be effective, especially in the U.S., I think is frankly deluded. There's too much of a gun culture, to be frank.
Problems, be they societal, political, cultural, personal, we need to stop being a culture that raises so many radicals and extremists. But we also need to do all of these other things which any other civilized country would have done if they were in our position.
Now, when you talk about, not raising these radicals and whatever, well, like I mentioned before, these people are obviously not detected by the system, before they commit these hideous acts. Another thing that you, once again, don't really mention, which is kind of disingenuous, again, I'm not saying that you are intentionally disingenuous, but it is a little bit of a lie by omission not to mention this. Some of these shootings are purely done for terrorist actions. Now, if you have just a regular criminal who's going to try and get a hold of a gun, just in general, then a terrorist will definitely try and get a hold of a gun, no matter how illegal it is. Ordinary criminals already don't care about the law, but terrorists, they usually actually have the connections to actually get these types of guns as well. So for terrorists, these gun control laws are even less, effective, really. And yeah, a lot of these mass shootings are terrorist acts as well. I'm not really sure the percentage as to how many are just lone maniacs and how many are terrorists, but a large part of them are due to terrorists, I know that much. So yeah, no, I mean, again, what do you do about the terrorists? They definitely don't care about these laws.
Which countries like New Zealand so quickly did once they suffered a mass killing event like this. So
now, what you have in New Zealand is, what I'm suspecting at least, is that you have politicians in their parliament who, basically wanted to strike while the iron was hot. This is something that a lot of activists for gun control laws do, and politicians for gun control do. Whenever you have one of these events, mass shootings, it's always then that they ramp up the activism and call for action now before it's too late. And when, like I mentioned before, we already know from the stats that these gun control laws don't seem to really do that much, honestly. Again, it's just the objective facts, so you can look at the stats yourself. Um, and, and, I just find it so very sickeningly opportunistic. It's very Machiavellian, you know. This tragedy happens, and now we're gonna try and exploit it, so we can, encroach on people's constitutional freedoms. That is to me sickening. I would never dream of abusing any kind of tragedy to try and make changes to the Constitution. But I don't know. I guess that's the difference between me and you, David.
The policies work, but they don't work individually. They need to be a package of policies, but the culture is a big part of this.
David, nations like Sweden already has the whole package that you're talking about. They already have like these very stringent gun control laws. They already have bans on most types of firearms and whatever. Doesn't stop the grenade attacks, doesn't stop the shootings from increasing now, do they? So despite the fact that Sweden has had these massive gun control laws, this very strict system for decades, despite that, we see an increase in gun crime, as well as grenade attacks. I'm sorry, but the proof is in the pudding. Gun control laws are ultimately very inefficient. Again, do I think that they can have some kind of impact in nations that already don't really have a gun culture? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I'm with you there. But when it comes to nations that already have, a gun culture, no. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And also, that effect, even in nations that already don't really have a gun culture, as we can tell, again, with Sweden, the effect obviously isn't that big, because you're still seeing an increase in gun crime, and it's an exponential increase, a very huge increase.
And so many other things relate to this, none of which the pro-gun fetishist American right wing, connected to the very well-funded gun lobby, is willing to even consider.
The National Rifle Association, whatever you think of them, I'm not a fan of them either. I don't like lobbyists. I don't. I hate lobbyism in politics. I find it absolutely horrendous, to be honest. I don't think lobbyism belongs in politics. However, what the NRA is, they are a membership organization whose purpose is to basically protect the Second Amendment. And David, considering that in most states of the U.S., I believe, you actually have, gun control laws, obviously this lobby isn't that powerful. You talk about them like they're some kind of big boogeyman, but hey, I'm just saying, obviously they don't have that much power. Now, I want to talk about another aspect of all of this. Now, let's say that, hypothetically, Bernie Sanders becomes president, which, honestly, I would support. And this is another thing I just want to add in here before, someone tries to call me some fucking right-wing gun nut. I mean, again, I'm not, but whatever. I actually support Bernie Sanders for president, so hey, well, I mean, I must be a fucking right-wing lunatic, right? But let's say that he actually became president, and he tries to implement a federal assault rifle ban, let's say. Do you honestly think that the states where they are very much against these gun control laws, do you think they would comply? Of course not. The governors of those states would essentially tell Bernie to go fuck himself, and they would tell the federal government to go fuck itself, and they would simply say, well, the majority of the population in this state doesn't believe in this, so we are not going to comply. These states would then be in open rebellion to the federal government. Now, one or two states doing this is really not that big of a deal. But when almost half of the states rebel against this, because trust me, they will. They will. Gun control laws are too unpopular in these states. They just are. What do you think is going to happen? You will have a political conflict, and if you take it far enough, it might actually ignite a second civil war. When these states rebel against the federal government, they're not actually wrong to do so. These gun control laws are a clear violation of the Second Amendment. According to the Second Amendment, Americans have a right to bear arms, and this right shall not be infringed. Now, to arbitrarily ban a certain type of firearm over another is a clear violation of the Second Amendment. And so we also come to another point. You see, David usually argues against certain practices, He argues against the death penalty because it is a cruel punishment, which is actually forbidden, I think, according to the 8th Amendment of the American Constitution. And I agree. I agree. He's also against the surveillance state that's being formed more and more because it violates the 4th Amendment. And I agree. But here's the thing. You have to make up your mind. Do you view the American Constitution as an absolute piece of legal text, whom all the other legislations have to be adapted to, or do you view it as a simple legal text like any other, susceptible to the whims of the cogs of democracy? Now, let me just make this clear. I'm not saying that one view of the American Constitution is more correct than the other. I mean, if you're going to go by the founding fathers, obviously the first one, where it's unchallengeable, is the more correct one. But the point is, whether you view the American Constitution as just another piece of legal text, which should be subject and to the democratic process and be updated over time, or if you view it as unchanging and robust and every other law has to be adapted to it, which one you choose to view it as, I have no problem with. It's your opinion, and I accept that. However, I do recognize that you can't have both. And David, since you so staunchly use the Constitution in your arguments against all the other things that you don't like, I'm going to have to declare the obvious. You are a hypocrite. To use some parts of the Constitution that you like to argue against certain practices in your nation, and yet to ignore other parts of it, is hypocrisy. Again, if you want to view the Constitution as any other malleable legal text, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But you have to pick one. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. And that goes for all of you who wants to argue on this topic. Whether you are left-wing or right-wing or in the center, which one is it? Just something to think about. Anyway, that's my analysis, and thank you for watching. And by the way, making these videos takes away time from my studying, and except for working as an actual chemistry teacher, I also study myself at the university. So making these videos takes time and energy, and takes away time from when I could actually be studying or working. So if you feel like you want to support me on Patreon, I would greatly appreciate it. I charge per video because then I actually have to work for my paycheck essentially from Patreon. I can't cheat, in other words. I don't want to have it on a monthly basis because then I would have the option of simply not making any videos for a month, and I would still, get paid by you guys, and I don't think that's fair. I actually want to work for it. So by having it on a per video basis, I actually have to work for it. So if you want to donate, please go ahead. And I only charge twice though. So if you decide to donate $2 per video, you would only pay max $4 every month. So that's something to think about. Anyway, please also follow me on social media. I do appreciate it. And yeah, take care, guys. Bye.